Hello and welcome to the first Esteem talk show. The idea behind this talk show was that the Esteem, as a non-political organization, strays away of putting any kind of agenda forward. But we are about one of our core values is embracing diversity and striving for participation. So we thought that we could gather around some students around Europe and have discussions around some interesting topics. Esteem as a neutral playground, as a neutral facilitator, would be hosting such discussions. So here we are in the first episode, which will be covering democracy in Europe and across Europe. We have got a couple of guests from well, quite representative from different parts of Europe. We have got Rob from from Germany, from France, shall I say? Where are you from, Rob? Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course I can. I'm Rob, or like Robert. Feel free to name me however you prefer. And I am currently living and studying in Berlin. But my parents are also from Berlin, but I'm actually born in France and raised there, went to school there, lived there for the first 18 years of my life. So I would definitely identify as both French and German. I also have both passports. Uh, yeah, that's so far for me.
So you are able to vote in both countries.
On for presidential or like parliamentary elections, yes. For local elections, in Berlin. Um,
Ah, all right, interesting. Well, we have also got Maria, but Maria, you are currently in Germany as well, right?
Yes, but originally I'm from Ukraine. I lived 18 years there, was born there, in Kyiv, the capital. Yes, now I'm staying and studying in Germany, on the west of Germany, in Aachen. Yeah, but I cannot, I have no right to vote in Germany, so I can only vote in Ukraine from obvious reasons. I don't have a German passport.
Yes. Thank you, Maria, for sharing. Tommy, how about you?
Hello, everyone. I'm Tommy. As the name would imply for anyone familiar with the Finnish language, I'm from Finland, from the from the city of Tampere, more specifically, or that is where I study at the given moment.
Yes, Tommy, can you explain to us your surname, which is Suomi? What does that mean?
Yes, the name means Finland. Simply put, in Finnish, it's the name of the country.
I think it's a very practical way of naming your child. You're like, yeah, so he's Finnish. I'm gonna put the nationality in his surname. Uh, yes, all of you guys are students. Am I correct? I would say that a part of being students, you guys are also frequent travelers, and well, some more than others. Rob, how long have you been in now in one spot?
so yeah, I came back to Berlin about already 12 days ago.
Oh.
So
Crazy.
yeah, crazy. So yeah, I'm actually like almost 2 weeks in Berlin, and then go back for Christmas to my parents. But yeah, uh, traveling about one time or like 1 week a month right now, which is still quite a lot, but a bit less than I used to.
Right. Do you guys do something apart from your studies? Do you have any extra jobs? Is that something that is relevant to you?
I mean, I'm working 10 hours a week in some research institute, which is doing like photonics, etc. But in all honesty, I do it a bit more on the side to get like a little bit of money and a bit of experience. But I'm probably doing a lot more for basically everything else. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's not
the
that
definition
important.
of job would, I think, imply you are getting paid. So I cannot claim to be working at the given moment, but I'm quite active in multiple student associations, taking up quite a bit of time each week.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that, Tommy.
Yeah.
Same.
For me
Maria, how
it's
about
also like that. I don't, like, I have a privilege kind of right now not to be like forced to work like a full time or even like 10 hours, so I kind of like study and also devote like my free time to student organizations, like other initiatives that I can maybe learn something from. Yeah, but not like working.
Interesting that you say that. Yeah, you do some studying, but then you also on your free time want to do something that actually where you actually learn. Curious how our approach is to university life. But all right, so from university life, talking about democracy, let's get to our topic. First and foremostly, we'll try to look at the differences between your countries and kind of like, yeah, how is the democratic situations? How relevant is it to people? How relevant is democracy to people? How much focus do they put on democracy? So the question to you guys is: we were looking a little bit at statistics of voting turnovers, which means how many people actually go for votings in your countries, in your elections. We see some differences. Basically, if you look at the map of Europe, there are some countries which lead, and some countries which are a little bit falling behind when it comes to frequency for voting. Um, for example, Finland has got quite a high rate, right? Tommy, do you remember,
Yes.
or shall I look up? I
At
can
the
look it
given
up.
moment, it's around
Mm,
70%. It varies a bit year by year. Uh,
mm,
Overall, it's quite considered quite strong, but there is definitely a trend of decline, as from around 1950s, since the war until around 1990s, the percentage remained consistently around 80%. But after the 90s, it has declined, but it has remained at around 70% now for some time.
mm. How about Germany? Germany does have a little bit higher even than that, 76 roughly, right?
Yes, about yeah, it depends for what elections exactly, but I think it's comparatively like except some little like small islands like the Faroe Islands or Malta, one of the higher ones inside of Europe. Um, yeah, people probably are quite caring about politics, and it's also, especially in Berlin, quite a discussion topic. And so
Mm,
most people actually, at least in my circle, do go to vote, but it's also been going a bit down. Yes, we can talk a
mm.
bit more about that a bit later.
Yeah, I think that those trends will be definitely interesting to discuss. But first, just to look at the other end of the spectrum, where we have Ukraine and France. They are at little bit below 50, right?
Um, it depends which kind of elections we're talking about, because for the presidential elections, it's higher in Ukraine. For the parliamentary elections, it's like way lower.
Yeah, it's about the same in France actually. Like the if you look at the past presidential elections, it's actually quite on par with Germany at about like a bit over 70%. But especially if it's just for the parliament, not as many people care. They probably
Hmm.
should care more, but
Yeah,
it's not
That is
not getting that many votes.
that is a
yeah.
good.
That's the difference.
Oh,
For Ukraine, yeah, for Ukraine, it's also the case. Like with the presidential, we have like 67, 67, I guess, and like with the parliamentary, it's like 45, which is super low.
that is a good point to highlight that there are, of course, separate elections. As for Finland, it's for parliamentary and presidential, around the same percentage. But when we go to the European Parliament elections, it actually drops off drastically and goes to around 40%.
Hmm. Do you think that that is because people don't care about the European elections as much as their
Yeah,
local
I
politics?
think they're perceived mostly as irrelevant to most things affecting people's daily lives, which is, of course, a bit of a naive view, perhaps, but they are seen quite separated. And Finland is also a relatively small nation, so people feel like the decision making is in the hands of larger nations, and their voices don't really matter that
Hmm.
much, is also sometimes expressed opinion.
Yeah, that is also something that is very curious to think about. I have a lot of friends, for example, that don't even vote because they say, but this is more. I wouldn't say that it's affects the whole nation, only it's individuals that feel that they don't have any impact on a democracy because they are just one vote, and what does that matter? But looking at the differences, well, Germany and France. countries that are so close to each other, they have very big differences. So Germany had roughly, well, 70%, something around that. France barely 50. Why do you think that is?
You mean for the EU Parliament votes or for which ones? For the
Well,
EU?
which ones were the ones with a bit lower?
Depends. So for the parliament, exactly. The Germany doesn't got a parliament vote. We only vote, uh, or like God doesn't got. We don't vote for a president. Our parliament directly votes for it. So yeah, the most important election, as it is perceived in Germany, is the one for our parliament. So that's, I think, why it has quite a high turnout. And in France, like I was saying before, the presidential elections also get quite a lot of voters. I just looked up like 73% last time. But then a couple of weeks later, there's the one for the parliament, which usually gets much lower rate, especially as there was like a bit more conflict, etc. This time, yeah, that is why for the parliament vote, at least, there's this high difference between the two.
All right. Maria, what do you think in Ukraine there is such a low voting frequency?
Um, I would say that like it really depends heavily on like people's perception of like what's important. As Rob mentioned, I think earlier, somehow people sometimes perceive that the parliament is not as important for politics as president, even though like in Ukraine we have the parliament president state, so it means that like parliament is kind of also very important. But people see like president as a face of everything that is happening there. So like as like just like basically kind of like as a person who's responsible for everything and do not really see the direct impact from the parliament, which is of course very big. They just like maybe it's like a lack of understanding of the processes and therefore it just like gets much less attention that it actually should get. And yeah, so like the elections of the president are usually way more interactive and like people are way more involved and they're like discussing it much more and it's always like a bigger topic than the parliament one.
So the presidential elections are more of a show, easier digestible for the general audience, while the parliamentary
it's also
elections are harder.
it's also I think it's a little bit easier to just perceive this and like just like to understand the elections of the president because you have like much less people there. You have just
Hmm.
like less candidates and they're like more not like parties but rather like the president who like is presents himself or like herself like themselves in a sense. And with parliament it's a little bit more complicated because also there are like parties and like different like stories and it's also like very a little bit more complicated also to comprehend all of that, so people
Yeah.
are also like tend to just like make it like to be more involved in the topics like when it's easier to make a decision or like to see something like to form an opinion on than like
So
with
the
the
complexity scares people away
yes
or
yes.
disengages them. Yeah. How about Finland? Finland has got a quite high voting turnover. What do you like? Do you think that the Finnish people don't feel this complexity? Uh, do you think that the Finnish people are well? Do they have more patience to learn about the systems of the parliaments? Why do you think they have a higher
I think a
turnover?
big uh, big reason for the percentage of parliamentary elections being higher is the fact that in Finland the position of president is very much a formal one, more akin to the monarchs of most modern European monarchies, where they have very limited say in policies and are more of a figurehead. Yet, because it is an important figurehead and very visible face of the nation, people are still interested in the election, and so I think that keeps the percentage high. But as far as really having a noticeable impact on the policies of the nation, you really have to go to the parliamentary elections. And we have a long tradition of democracy and a pretty highly educated populace. So most people are
Hmm.
keen on having an effect on the uh, like nationwide politics.
I think it's well to touch on education and on having an educated populace. Um, what does your governments or your countries do to kind of keep the and maintain the the population educated and engaged and interested? I mean, for example, Tom, you said that in Finland you have a long history of strong democratic spirit, so to say, people being interested, people being engaged. Is this something that the government tries to somehow consciously contribute to, work on? Is it educated on in schools? How
That's
does
an
it look?
interesting question. I don't feel the government has that of a big effect. Like there isn't active. Of course, there is always advertisement of elections, but I feel like the it really isn't pushed on the populace that much. It's more like a well-established tradition that maintains itself, and I think the like importance of uh, being a part of the society and playing your part is highlighted through the education system more. So I think that contributes to it. But I do think it's a very cultural thing that doesn't need so much pushing as it happens itself.
Hmm. How about France? Because France is, if I remember correctly, it's one of the oldest democracies, according to my history books. But now we see a decline in the parliamentary participation of voters. Rob, what do you think about that? And is it a failure of the state to encourage
Oof.
and educate?
Uh, okay, that's very, very, very big questions about current
Hmm.
political season. Maybe to take it back for now to the question about how general education works around it and how important people think the elections are, or how informed they get about it. Um, I think actually France and Germany are not that different in that regard, where there's both in school also like a dedicated class to it usually, or at least like at least you would talk about it in history or geography.
Sorry,
So
Rob. What kind of class?
where you basically get taught about your own political system, how it works, because it's in both terms a bit different and quite to some extent complicated.
Hmm.
So about those things, but also, I mean, at least with some of my German history teachers, we also talked about basically going through some parties program. Uh, yeah, so looking through the program that some of the German parties had, and basically discussing about that together. So those things definitely do happen. And I don't think they're that different between the two countries. What is a bit different, and maybe then indeed the point where the parliament, especially in France, is going so much lower, is that especially recently, um, the trust in our current president, which is Emmanuel Macron, has been going out down quite a lot. He's been kind of seen as this figurehead of the center politics since the very beginning in his first mandate, but since then he's taking much more of a right turn,
Hmm.
and a lot of people are not that much approving of it. And especially in the last elections, it was a bit of a conflict because then in this, like, we have a first round and then a second round where the two most voted presidential candidates in the first round continue on,
Hmm.
and in that round, he was facing even more right wing uh, candidate. So then a lot of the left wing had like kind of voted for Emmanuel Macron out of to make a blockade towards their totally right wing, but they were still very dissatisfied with him and also were kind of lost hope on the votes anyway, and therefore didn't vote in the second one. But in general, the democracy, I think, is seen as quite important, and the revolution itself is also quite romanticized often. So yeah, a bit of a mixed bag,
Yeah,
especially recently.
I feel still that it is quite. I mean, well, I would ask then in Finland, do you guys also have classes for
Yes,
democracy?
we have. I think the correct name would be social studies, uh, starting from the seventh
Hmm.
grade, and for a long time, all students had to attend school at least until ninth grade. So there is like 3 years of
Hmm.
social studies, has been a pretty long-lasting tradition, during which you are explained like the relatively simplistic overview, but concepts of like from economics to the political system to how does the judiciary work and such.
Okay. Maria, how about in Ukraine? I would now I'm making bold statements, but I would say that Ukraine is a much younger democracy and a democracy that you guys had to fight for. Um, do you feel that there is active there are active well conscious work to make the population strive for democracy?
From the side of the government, like we do have classes in school. We have like the civil education and also law classes, like that kind of are supposed to teach you how the government works, what kind of like different government forms exist, and like so that like you can see the difference and you can learn also the processes of how it's being done and like how it affects people's life and so on, so on, so on. But I wouldn't say that like it's taken like to its max extent and like it's super efficient. We do have it as a fact in school and also in universities, but I would say like the biggest force of like that is moving the education in terms of like democracy and also how it's working, it's more like proactive young and also older people who are kind of like working with like society, giving some lectures or also like speaking influencers. We now are like super active in internet, like in the world overall, and most of the information is usually spread there then. So it's more like society driven and not more that much like government driven. That's just the feeling that I was getting while like studying in school and also like studying in university in Ukraine.
Can you give some examples of how society is pushing the? Are there some concrete examples of?
Um, yeah, I can try. Like it can sound a little bit vague, but like since like for a lot of young people in Ukraine, it's a very true that with the Russian Federation invading our country in 2014, so like almost half of our like conscious life for young people, we were living like with this feeling of threat to our democracy. So for example, I was 11 years old when it happened, actually 10. Yeah, but like for me, I'm now almost 20, so it means like half of my life I was like living with like a constant threat, understanding of like constant threat to democracy. So that means that like a lot of people were growing up with like having more thoughts about that, because it's not usually taken that much for granted when you are in a state when it can be like taken from you. So it's more like a social discussions that are like happening all the time, like politics and like the overall democracy is like a high topic and really hot topic for like most of gatherings. So like it's a topic that is always present, and like a lot of influencers and also active people that are having like the audience in internet are talking also about that and are discussing these topics and are also sharing opinions. So it's more like it's constantly present in the air. And there are also a lot of lectures that are given like at the universities or also like with private or government organizations. So it's like more from the side of like people constantly raising discussions about this, if that makes sense.
As for, I can share a little bit of how it looks like in Poland. So in Poland we had elections quite recently. We had during the last couple of mandates a quite right wing party that was dominating, but that really encouraged people, yeah, especially young people, to go out and vote. So do you guys feel that that's depending a little bit on yeah, who is in power and how long they're in power? Does that affect how keen people are voting? I mean, Rob, that's what you mentioned with Macron, right? Is this is it significant, you feel, or is it just like one more percent? How did it go, Rob?
Uh, if you're asking about youth in general, I think the whole population, especially in France, got very, very politicized in the last years.
Hmm.
So that had quite an effect on the discussion, but it's also not a super new thing. But in general, I would say youth in both countries is quite politically active. Like, I mean, especially in Berlin, that's absolutely crazy. Like, I've got a lot of, like, crazy in the terms that it's very, very, very important. Like, I've got a lot of friends who very regularly go to protests on, yeah, very, very diverse actions and issues. And it's also, especially with my circle of friends here, also quite usual to talk about politics together and then also vote. So yeah, of course, like current events have influence on the youth vote.
Yeah, Tommy, I don't believe that Finland has any
Yeah,
bigger. Well,
it's more of a just pendulum swing that always the opposition will gather more votes, historically speaking, than the parties in power. But it really isn't like dependent on like it doesn't really drive the youth vote or other generations vote. That specifically, it's more just about the specific parties, and it tends to be like there. Like of course, there's some leaning as far as which age groups vote which parties, but I think it's relatively even compared to many other countries where there is a more noticeable generation difference.
and I can imagine that. Well, I will not be making assumptions because I don't know. That's why I'm inviting you guys. You guys are the experts, and you will be sharing. So Maria, how was it in Ukraine, especially with the war? Does this push people towards democracy? Does it push people towards taking interest in this?
Definitely it does, but it also creates like different layers to it in terms of like it creates also like a layer of emotional exhaustions. It also creates a level of like hopelessness in a way that also sometimes affects the way people perceive the importance of everything, and not even politics, just like everything in life overall. But it definitely was pushing democracy and like people's interest in democracy a lot, especially after the revolution of dignity that happened in 2014. There was like the kind of like peak of fight for democracy inside of the country, at this point. So it definitely pushes a lot of, like, as I've already said, discussions and everything, um, especially also among the young people who are, as for now, like, are great in kind of the future of the country. So
And so, how is it? Well, yeah, you guys are students. I think that we can put some focus on the student perspective. How does it look for the youth? How engaged is the future of the democracies in various topics? Do you guys feel that youth are interested in these questions? Well, Rob, you have got Berlin where people are very interested. Do you think that the youth in rural areas of Germany or France are that interested? Do you feel that there some polarizations?
There's definitely differences. I think Berlin is quite often extreme, quote unquote, example where people are usually very, very politicized. Yeah, I guess even in other bigger cities, it can be quite strong. And in rural areas, it might be a bit less important. Um, yeah, I guess especially the more disconnected people in general feel with the politics, which usually used to be more of a tendency in rural areas, at least in Germany, or in general with maybe like also social economically poorer people. Um, that if you feel more disconnected, then you will also have less of a tendency to be engaged in politics and also go to vote. Um, but still, I also like, as Germany is kind of a like very spread out population where like literally everywhere you got like a bit of a more or less important city. I would say that even if you go, like, we don't have that many like very, very rural areas as they might have, I don't know, in the States or even in some parts of France. So like I have people I know from all over Germany who care a lot and especially young people from all over Germany who care a lot. So I think in general people are quite interested and in general quite involved. Although of
It
course there's
seems,
always exceptions.
yeah, it sounds very much like Germany is actually quite a homogeneous group in that case, even if there are small differences on the broad. You say that people are interested. Um, how is it in Ukraine then? Ukraine has got, I mean, Ukraine is a huge agricultural uh, country, so to say. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that
Yes,
means that, yeah,
kind of.
you guys have, yeah, you have a lot of well, countryside. That's I think the word. How do you feel?
Yes, it is true. We have like also like pretty much a lot of diversity in that terms and in that sense. And I would also say like in Ukraine there are quite a few like very big cities. There also are um, believed to be like centers of the like regions in Ukraine. And then like of course like the most active things and the most like actively involved people are usually living in like bigger cities, not in smaller ones. But it's more like in a sense, it doesn't mean that people who are like living in smaller cities or like who are living in like more rural areas are less involved. It's more like much more happening like in terms of protests and also like things are happening like in bigger cities. So like it's pretty common, especially like when there is a big wave, um, to for people like from smaller and like rural areas just like come to bigger cities like to join the protests in in that sense. But like I would also say it's pretty how Rob described it earlier, that like the more people are disconnected, like the less they feel the need to actually participate. But in Ukraine, it's more like a lot of things are centered, especially like among young people, are centered like around universities, because this is like the most like concentration points of people, like of young people who are kind of like also often want to do some impact. So it's pretty common then like that the most like active spots are in bigger cities, of course, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people in like quieter or like rural areas are like non-connected to the topic at all.
Hmm. And how is it for the students of
Well,
Suomi?
not just students, but well, talking of students specifically, the percentage for voting is somewhat lower than the general populace. It has been,
Oh, students
yes,
vote less
yes, it's
than
around
the average.
10 to
Oh,
15% lower. It has increased somewhat in the. Alright, okay, that's a good definition of students because it's young people, because not all young people study. So I actually do think that students are generally speaking quite active as far as voting, as politics do play a big part in university also and are quite visible. So students specifically, I do feel vote a lot, but younger people, as a wider group, are less likely to vote than older people, which I think also is reflected in the previously mentioned trend where the overall rate of voting has declined from around 80% to closer to 70%. That does show like that in the past the older populace was more active in voting, and it remains to this day. But one really interesting difference to Ukraine is that actually the most active locations vote-wise are the smallest, like municipalities, and it might be that it's perceived that they have like economics wise they are of course kind of losing to the big cities. They are People are moving out of them, and they are having other issues. So they feel like politics is a important tool for them to like maintain the basic services, for example, in the like near them. So they are more likely to go vote than the population of bigger cities.
I'm curious. Do you guys have, how do your social circles look like? Do you have some? Do you know some youth that are not students? I, for example, come um, from the suburbs of Gothenburg, and I have very many of my peers that they went to elementary school. They barely passed high school, and they did not continue on to higher educations. And I feel that a lot of them feel distrust to our democracy. They don't really believe that there is any point in voting, because they are just one vote amongst millions. Do you guys have friends amongst, well, that basically don't have higher educations, and do you see a difference in their attitudes? Rob, for example, can go.
Sure. So in my personal case, I come from a very, very bourgeois area of the Paris region. So like around Versailles, where I also went to school, like to a French-German school though. So it was very, very international, but also a bit quote unquote elitist, definitely to some
Mm,
extent. And so most of my friends I know from where I used to live are, although like spread all across the world, basically all studying now.
mm,
And in as most of my friend circle in as I moved to Berlin a bit later is then also people I met through university or university clubs. It's also in average mostly students. So yeah, in my social circle, there's very very few people who are non-students.
mm.
How about you, Maria?
And
Oh yeah, sorry.
Um,
mm,
yeah, so for my case, it's also like I was born and like raised in a capital, which already has a little bit like different like way of just like perceiving the education, its importance or like non-importance and so on and so on. And on top of that, I also was like finishing the school that was just like not just basic school. It was like a school with a bit like more difficulty level. That means that like all of the my classmates, they also were like going to universities, and I also started my studies right away. I do have though quite a few friends who are not studying, but it's not that they are not aiming to do so. They're just like have different circumstances that do not allow them to study at this point, but they're like striving for like going to university at some point. So I don't really have the representation of people who are like very non-interested in that at all. And so yeah, that's basically how my social circle looks like at this
I'm
point.
quite I'm quite in the
Tommy,
same
how
boat.
about you?
My situation is pretty similar to Maria's. That I went to a, yeah, sort of a public school, as there are basically no private schools in Finland, but there are some separations in like the difficulty levels of the classes. And I also ended up in a school where the students were doing well, and as such, most of like the people I grew around ended up also attending universities. So I'd say most are students. I do have some friends who didn't attend universities, but they still like uh, I would say are pretty politically active, and they were for other reasons maybe losing interest in studying, ended up not going to university, but they still were like relatively active throughout their younger years and politically informed.
So you all mentioned that your social circles are those of people, or yeah, of youth that tend to be more striving for higher education, but still staying with the thought of socioeconomic differences. Um, we read, or I read, a study that, again, based on Sweden, can't really say it for rest of Europe, that there is a correlation between higher socioeconomic status and voting tendencies. Do you guys think that there is a challenge for that there comes a challenge for society that basically only the educated and well, the elite, quote unquote, the elite part of society starts to vote, while the other ones are will not vote? Very open questions, and now we're into predicting futures. But what do you think?
Yes, but I just like wanted to ask a question. I don't really fully understand at this point when we're talking about like youth. Why do
Hmm.
we necessarily connect economical state of like individual with the education at this point? Because this is the point I'm a little bit confused with. because like economical state of an individual and like whether they had the education or not is a little bit non-related in this topic for me when we talk about younger people.
Well, I
Tommy?
would say that generally speaking, most studies point towards people from better off backgrounds being more likely to attend higher education. So there is definitely some correlation. But I do get the point of like like the individual students, social economics. If we are just viewing like students, then it's less impactful. But if we're viewing young people as a whole, then it plays a bigger part in do you become a student in the first place?
Okay.
So posing the question like this, that do you find it problematic that students, people of higher education, vote while the people of without higher education do not? Do you see that as a future problem for society?
uh, Not necessarily, because I also think that um, like higher education, when we talk, for example, as of university, it's not necessarily like the only way to like define whether a person like strikes to be like socially active or anything, especially at this point where like in Ukraine, for example, we used to have a really big pressure on young people of like being obliged to go and get like higher education to study at university, otherwise you're not like um, complete, kind of like, then like if you're not studying at university, like it means that something is wrong with you in a way, that like you didn't do well, and like so on so on. But at this point it also changes a lot, and higher education is important, but it's also like not taken as only university. So like there are a lot of like also you say like education that you can get, but not necessarily like in university, like Ausbildung, I don't know the word for that in English, I'm sorry, but it's like just like a profession you learn, and not everyone is like necessarily has to study at university, and it doesn't really like define a person as like striving for development or striving for like being active in a political or social sense. So I wouldn't really connect that, like if less people are going to universities, that would like mean that less people, young people, will vote. Because from my perspective it's more like it depends more like on whether people are becoming more socially aware and social, like, and conscious about like their actions, which is not directly correlated to people going to universities more, because going to university without a clear purpose is also not really the best decision you can make. So that's, if like my point is clear at this question.
Mhm. Yeah, just to answer, I think the English penalty Ausbildung would be something like apprenticeship or something like that, if that is understood by, yeah. So something like that. And indeed, especially in the last years, especially in Germany, there has been a huge shift where suddenly politics remember, oh, now for like the last or like for the last years, we always told people, go study, else there's you cannot make it in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Never recently, oh, now suddenly we actually need a lot of people who do like more of craftsman tasks, which are also extremely important in society. I mean, the society can work if there is no people who, I don't know, can,
Carpenters make doors,
yeah,
make furniture.
like, yeah. So to so that is definitely the case where this is actually getting much more promoted. Yeah, like you actually have ads around the bigger cities where to encourage people to like actually engage themselves into the Ausbildung, which I guess is a very good point, because it is very very important right now. For what's to come back to your original question, um, about if it's a problem that in general in the whole situation people with lower socioeconomic status, or also people like students might be more involved politically than non-students, which is definitely the case. I think it's not a huge problem to begin with, but it can uh, kind of influence on the what I was already talking about, connection, how connected people feel with politics. So um, if indeed politics continues to be even more or concerned to like more of the like educational elite, a lot of the population will not feel represented. And in a democracy, that is a big, big problem, because as soon as you have a significant population who does not feel represented, they will either, I don't know, for example, go towards like extremist opinions, or they will organize stuff themselves, which is then working parallelly to the government, or just in general, it will increase the unsatisfaction that people have with living in a certain country, which again can lead to very big movements, which are usually also not very helpful for the development of a country. So in those regards, it is definitely something to be aware about.
I think that this is a good stepping stone for our next topic, where we'll be talking about the challenges with democracy, challenges that democracy faces, and if even democracy is what well, the optimal way of governing a population. But before we jump on to the next topic, Tommy, would you like to also share how it is from your Finnish
On the
perspective?
prayer question, I do agree mostly with what Rob stated. Also, that it's it's a sort of two-sided coin, where in a sense you do want people to be informed first to vote, and so it's like a natural outcome that the more educated people are more informed and hence more likely to vote. And I don't see voting for sake of voting necessarily to be a value to strive for, because then you will have uninformed opinions. But at the same time, you don't want people to be dissatisfied and feel like the democracy does not concern them. So you do want to keep them engaged and informed. But it's really about like the part of having them first informed. I think that's the value to strive for. And after they are informed, they will be more likely to vote.
Yeah, I absolutely go with that. I mean, I think it's a bit two-sided. So of course, the the more politicians, or like in general governments, will try to reach all parts of the population, like both in terms of socioeconomic status, like where you where you come from, what do you do, and also age. The more everybody will feel represented, and the more people will be inclined to it. But of course, I lose the train of my thoughts. Oh yeah, but at the end, the main pillar of what will make people be informed about politics is exactly this education. So to really indeed push in school to educate people how they can inform themselves about what certain parties want to do, how to make people like automatically think it is a very important task, will at the end need to go through education. And I mean, I don't think at least in France and Germany, it's going that badly, but there's definitely still some improvements which could be possible.
And with that, I think that we can end this episode of the talk show. So, with us today were Robert Zastrov, Tommy Somi, and Maria Dvorak. Thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on democracy in your countries, and sharing with us how democracy works, and your thoughts around the challenges of it. In the next episode of the talk show, we will be discussing with the same guests if democracy really is the best way to govern a people, the best way to lead a country. So stay tuned for the next episode of the Esteem European Youth Talk Show.